In this video, we will complete the relational database design that we had started to build using Visio. So just to refresh your memory, this is the relational database design that we are going to finish building. And up to now, the last two tutorials, we have focused on this part of the diagram. And in doing so, I've shown you how to design or build the entities using the Visio database modeling tool, and in particular how to set up the relationships and their cardinalities. So we'll quickly go through the rest of the diagram and building it up, and in the process I will give particular attention to these two relationships that you see in solid lines. Those are the identifying relationships for weak entities, and we haven't covered those yet in the previous two tutorials, so that I'll emphasize those portions when I get to them. So let's continue building this diagram, and I'll first introduce the project entity. So let's do that. So here's our Visio building sheet. Let me scroll down a bit. So the next entity that I'm going to build is project. So I won't elaborate on this too much since we have done this before. So here's the project entity. Now I define the columns, including the primary key. So let me see what they were. So project ID is the primary key. Let me put that in. Project ID, I will specify it as required and that it's the primary key. Check those two boxes off. And the next attribute is project name, department max hours. So let me I'll just give a short project name is required. Then I will put in max hours is also required. Every project has an allocated maximum hours, so if you blow that limit, then of course the project is over budget and that has to be justified. So let me put in max hours and make that a number just to change the data type. So let's make it an integer, required. Now let's coming back to this diagram. You can see department here. Actually, department is a foreign key that will ultimately link project to department. And you can go back to my previous tutorial to see why we need to manually add this foreign key in project. The primary key of the one becomes the foreign key of the many. So we're going to put that attribute in called department simply to link project back to department. Okay. So let me do that now. So here is department, and I make that required, and I can move it up if I want to just make it look like the same as in the PowerPoint slide. So department was next to project name. So coming back to the Visio diagram, the next two attributes are not required. One is the start date, and I will make the data type instead of character. I'll hit the drop down button and let's make that a date, and the end date, I think end date, make that a date as well. Okay, so I think I have all the attributes for project. Let's just make sure, compare it to the PowerPoint slide. I think I do. So at the moment you don't see the label FK1, foreign key 1, next to department. That will come once we set up this relationship. So now I'm going to connect department with project. So I might need to move things around a bit just to make a little space for myself. So I bring in the relationship tool. I connect the one side to department, the many side to project. Let me move this down a little bit. Okay. So here we go. And we're not quite done yet, because if you look at the cardinalities in the PowerPoint slide, you have a mandatory cardinality here next to department and an optional next to project. So the project side is fine. I think by now you know how to fix this. So I would highlight the relationship, and in the definition of the relationship right now, you can see that department name is connected to department name in project. So this was automatically created. This foreign key called department name was automatically created by Visio when I connected the relationship. So what I'm going to do now is to change the connection manually. So here I have department name, which is the primary key of department. Here's department name is the primary key of department, and I connect it manually to the foreign key called department in project. So you have this attribute that we had manually put in for project. So I highlight those two and I say associate, and you can see that the mandatory cardinalities have shown up. Okay, so the only thing that remains is to clean up after Visio by deleting this attribute that it had put in automatically. So I delete DEPTNAME. So I just highlight the entity project and scroll down, and here's department name, and I remove it. Okay, all right, so let me scroll down a little bit here. So okay, maybe I'll, all right, so now you can see the picture as a whole. Compare it to the PowerPoint slide, and you can see we've got projects set up properly now. This particular entity and the relationship has been set up correctly. Now I'm going to work on this part of the diagram, and in doing so I'll first set up assignment. Remember, this is what's called an associative entity or an associative relation, because we can't represent many-to-many relationships directly in a relational database design. It has to be done through an associative entity like this. So a many-to-many relationship between employee and project is represented by a pair of one-to-many relationship between those two entities and an associative entity called assignment. So first I'll set up this entity called assignment, and then I will connect the relationship, because you can't set up relationships until you have the entities to which they are connected. So first let me set up the entity called assignment. So coming back to Visio, let me scroll down a little bit here. I bring in this tool called, for the entity tool, go to definition, and I will give it the name assignment. So far so good. Now let's go to the columns. Okay, so I'm going to start putting in the columns for assignment. Now going back to my picture, you can see that the primary key of assignment is a composite primary key. It consists of the primary keys of employee and project patched together. So you have project ID, which is the primary key of project, and you have employee number, which is the primary key of employee, and those two have been combined together to give the composite primary key. So I'm going to do the same thing but use slightly different names, and you will see why in a minute. So I'm going to take this primary key over, bring it here. I'm going to take this primary key over and bring it here, create a composite primary key, but I'll use slightly different names. Okay, so the first column or attribute that I create, instead of calling it project ID, I will just call it, got the wrong capital lock set, proj ID. Okay, and I'll make it required and prime PK. Now I'm doing this deliberately. You could have set it up with the original primary key name. I'm doing this deliberately again to show you how Visio works, and I would suggest you do the same until you get familiar with the tool, with the software tool. So basically this proj ID is a proxy for project ID. It's just the same thing as project ID. I've just given it a slightly different name, and I have specified it as required primary key. Okay, next I bring in the other primary key, that is emp number. So instead of writing emp number, I will just write something slightly different, emp num, and again I will say required primary key. So you see I've set up a composite primary key over here consisting of these two attributes. And again, the reason I gave them slightly different names for the columns is just to remind me that I have put those names in manually. It is not something that Visio put in automatically during the process of making connections. Okay, so this is just for understanding purposes really. All right, so there is one last attribute, and that's hours worked by the employee on that particular project. So I have to put in this attribute called hours worked. So let me put that in. So HRS, capital letters, HRS, hours worked, and instead of character 10, let me make that an integer. Okay, and I don't believe it's required. Let me check. Yeah, it's not in boldface, so it's not required. So I'm done creating the relation called assignment. Now I have to make the connections. So let's review what the connections are. You have a one-to-many relationship from employee to assignment. You have a one-to-many relationship from project to assignment. But notice the links are, the lines are solid on both cases, reminding us that these are identifying relationships. Namely, assignment is a weak entity. Assignment only exists because employee and project exist. So we have to keep that in mind when we set up the relationships. All right, so let me bring in the relationship tool. So I drop it in here. The one I connect to employee, the many I connect to assignment. Now notice one thing that has happened right off the bat. So as soon as I put in this one-to-many relationship, Visio automatically put in emp number as the foreign key. It always does that when you put in a one-to-many relationship. It's trying to be helpful because whenever you have a one-to-many relationship, the primary key of the one becomes the foreign key of the many. So it put in this emp number, this primary key of the one, it automatically put it in as the foreign key of the many. Okay, it thinks it's being helpful, but in this case it's not. All right, so I need to fix things here. Let me put in the other relationship first, and you will see the same behavior. So here's relationship. I bring the tool in here. The one connects to project, the many connects to assignment, and once again, do you see it took project ID and stuck it in here in the assignment as a foreign key. It does this automatically just because of the one-to-many relationship we introduced. So we are on our way to getting things fixed, but not quite there. If you compare the picture we have now to the picture that we have in the PowerPoint slide, let me clean this up a little bit. Too many red lines. Okay, so we are now going to focus on these two relationships. First of all, you can see that they are solid in, and we don't have that as solid in our diagram. So I click on the relationship, and again, when I look at the categories in terms of specifying the details of the relationship, if I click on miscellaneous, you can see that if I specify the relationship as identifying, it automatically changes it to a solid line, and the cardinality becomes mandatory 1, 1. Okay, so let's look at the picture in the PowerPoint slide. We have fixed the left hand side, correct? So we have a solid line, the mandatory cardinality on the left, the optional and many on the right hand side. Now if you wanted a vertical bar here, if you wanted a 1, that is every employee is assigned to at least one assignment, then of course you can click on this relationship again, and on the cardinality side, instead of 0 or more, you can just check 1 or more, and that would make it 1. You can see it made it 1, but that's not what we want, so let me set it back to 0. Okay, so we fixed the left hand side of the picture of the relationship. Now let's fix the right hand relationship. Again, go back to your PowerPoint slide. It's an identifying relationship. So I check the box which is identifying, and we are set. Okay, so we are almost there. Now notice what is another thing that has happened along the way as we made these two relationships identifying. So the foreign keys that Visio had put in automatically, namely emp number and project ID, they got moved up to this upper box as primary keys and foreign keys. Okay, So we need to take those two out, and that's very easy to do. By now you know that basically you go back to the you take this, so each of these relationships we go to the definition. Okay, so look, for this definition we have a one-to-many relationship from employee to assignment. So let's look at what we have here. You can see Visio is telling us that this one-to-many relationship is defined by emp number in employee, that is this fellow, being connected to emp number in assignment. So instead of doing that, what I will tell Visio is, here I have emp number, I want to connect it to emp num. That's the foreign key that I had manually put in. Remember, that's why I had chosen a slightly different name. I choose emp num and I tell Visio to associate. It's done that. So do you see it has changed emp num to primary key and foreign key? All right. So now I highlight the other relationship on the right hand side, and once again I tell Visio that I want this relationship to be captured by project ID in project, that's this attribute, and it should connect to proj ID, that's the foreign key that I had manually put into the picture. Okay, so now when I say associate, do you see that it associated those two attributes and the foreign key has been corrected? All I have to do now is go back and clean those automated the attributes that had been put in automatically. I just need to clean those out. So I highlight assignment and I go back, this emp number which had been put in automatically by Visio, I remove it. Then I go back and I pick up project ID which had been also put in automatically, and I remove it. So all that remains is the attributes that I had put in manually. So I want to retain control over how the design has been done. And let me take the circles handles out from the boxes, and you can see you have the diagram that you just compare this diagram we have just created with what was there in the PowerPoint slide, and we are done with creating this relational database design. So we took the original ER diagram, which was in a crow's foot notation, and then transformed it to a relational database design. So let me stop this tutorial for now, and in the last tutorial I will show you how to sort of enhance this diagram with recursive relationships and supertypes, subtypes. Okay.